Something just changed, and most Americans have no idea what it means yet. For decades, the United States Navy has been the unquestioned king of every ocean, every gulf, every strait on this planet. Aircraft carriers like the USS Abraham Lincoln weren't just warships, they were messages, ironclad billion-dollar messages sent to every government on Earth that said, don't even think about it. But here's what the Pentagon doesn't want to sit in your living room with you and explain slowly. The nature of military dominance is shifting. Hypersonic missiles, drone swarms, asymmetric warfare doctrine. Iran has spent 30 years studying exactly how America projects power, and more critically, where it is most exposed. The Persian Gulf is not a show of American strength anymore. Increasingly, military analysts are calling it something far more uncomfortable, a trap. And the USS Abraham Lincoln may have just sailed into the center of it. This is not a movie. This is not speculation. This is the geopolitical reality that changes everything. America's global image, its military credibility, its alliances, and the future of oil, power, and war in the 21st century. Stay with me, because what happened, why it happened, and what comes next is something every American deserves to understand. Let's start with something that most American news anchors will never say out loud on primetime television, and that is this. The United States has been operating on a military mythology that is dangerously outdated, and the Persian Gulf has become the single most explosive pressure point on the entire planet where that mythology is being tested in real time. Now, I want you to understand something before we go further. This isn't about rooting for one side or another. This is about understanding the world as it actually is, not as we wish it were, not as Pentagon press briefings describe it, and certainly not as cable news packages it between car insurance commercials. The reality of what is unfolding in the Gulf is something that every working American, every tax-paying citizen, every person who sends their son or daughter into uniform deserves to understand fully and without the comfortable cushion of propaganda. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning of how we got here, because nothing that is happening today fell out of the sky. Everything happening right now in the Persian Gulf is the product of decades of choices, American choices, Iranian choices, choices made by kings and generals and oil executives and weapons contractors. And the bill for all of those choices is now coming due in a way that is reshaping the entire architecture of global power. When the United States first began stationing naval forces in the Persian Gulf in a serious and permanent way, the logic was straightforward. Oil, pure and simple. The Gulf is the artery through which the lifeblood of the global industrial economy flows. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow and strategically vital choke point that sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Whoever controls access to that strait holds enormous power over the global economy. And for decades, the United States positioned itself as the self-appointed guardian of that strait, projecting naval power from carrier strike groups like the one built around the USS Abraham Lincoln to make absolutely certain that no regional power could threaten that flow of oil. The Abraham Lincoln isn't just a ship. It is a floating city of military capability, carrying dozens of fighter jets, thousands of sailors and Marines, and enough firepower to flatten a mid-sized nation. For decades, the mere presence of an American carrier in the Gulf was enough to keep adversaries in check. That was the logic, that was the strategy, and for a long time it worked, or at least it appeared to work. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely dangerous. While the United States was busy being the world's policeman, spending trillions of dollars on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that produced largely catastrophic results by any honest measure, Iran was busy doing something far more strategically sophisticated. Iran was studying America carefully, methodically, obsessively. Iranian military planners, many of them educated in Western institutions before the revolution and deeply aware of American strategic doctrine, spent decades analyzing exactly how the United States projects power and more importantly, where that power is most exposed and most vulnerable. What they concluded, and this conclusion has been written about openly in Iranian military literature that American analysts have largely chosen to downplay, is that American power projection in the Gulf is built on a set of assumptions that modern technology has fundamentally undermined. The carrier strike group, that crown jewel of American naval power, was designed in an era when the primary threat came from other blue water navies. It was designed to fight the Soviet Navy in open ocean combat. It was never designed to operate in a geographically constrained body of water like the Persian Gulf against an adversary that has spent 40 years developing the specific weapon systems needed to sink it. And this is the part that should keep every serious American strategist awake at night. Iran did not try to build a navy that could match the United States carrier for carrier, destroyer for destroyer. That would have been impossible and pointless. Instead, Iran invested massively in what military analysts call asymmetric warfare, the art of defeating a stronger opponent not by matching their strength, but by attacking their weaknesses in ways they cannot easily defend against. Iran developed an enormous arsenal of anti-ship ballistic missiles, some of them capable of traveling at hypersonic speeds. They developed swarms of small, fast attack boats that can overwhelm a carrier's defensive systems through sheer numbers. They developed sophisticated sea mines. They developed land-based missile systems positioned throughout the mountainous terrain surrounding the Gulf that can rain fire down on any naval vessel operating in those waters. They developed drone technology that is now among the most advanced and battle-tested in the world, refined through years of proxy conflict in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. And perhaps most significantly, they developed the command and control infrastructure to coordinate all of these capabilities simultaneously in what military theorists call an anti-access area denial strategy, A2AD for short, designed specifically to make the Persian Gulf a killing ground for American carrier strike groups rather than the safe hunting ground it once was. Now let's bring this into the immediate present because the context matters enormously for understanding what the destruction of assets like the Abraham Lincoln and American Gulf bases actually means in the larger picture. The tensions between the United States and Iran have been building towards some kind of catastrophic breaking point for years, arguably since 2018, when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, that had been painstakingly negotiated over years of diplomacy. When America walked away from that agreement, it did not just kill a diplomatic arrangement. It sent a message to Iran and to every other nation watching that American commitments are unreliable, that diplomatic agreements with Washington can be torn up on a political whim, and that the only real security any nation has is the security it can provide for itself through its own military capability. If you want to understand why Iran has continued to develop its military capabilities at the pace it has, look no further than that moment. America's withdrawal from the nuclear deal was the single greatest gift the hardliners in Tehran ever received, because it proved their argument that America cannot be trusted, that negotiations are a trap, and that only military strength guarantees survival. Then came the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. Now, whatever you think of Soleimani, and there are legitimate arguments about the role he played in regional violence, the manner of his killing, a drone strike at a civilian airport, was a dramatic escalation that sent shockwaves through the entire Middle East and beyond. Iran retaliated almost immediately with ballistic missile strikes on American bases in Iraq, strikes that were more accurate and more sophisticated than anyone in the American military establishment had publicly anticipated. Over 100 American troops suffered traumatic brain injuries. And here is the critical thing. Iran telegraphed those strikes in advance through Iraqi back channels, almost certainly to avoid triggering a full-scale war. They were demonstrating capability while leaving an off-ramp. They were showing what they could do, but they were also showing restraint. And in military signaling, a demonstration of capability combined with deliberate restraint is one of the most powerful messages you can send. It says, we chose not to destroy you today, but we could. Fast forward to the present crisis, and what we are seeing is the culmination of everything that has been building since that moment. American carriers operating in the Gulf are not operating in the same strategic environment they operated in 20 years ago. The technology landscape has shifted dramatically. Iranian ballistic missiles have become significantly more accurate. Iranian drone technology, battle tested in Yemen, where Houthi forces have used it to strike deep inside Saudi Arabia and even reach Israeli territory, has matured into a serious military capability that no honest defense analyst dismisses anymore. And Iran has spent years positioning assets, missile batteries, drone launch sites, fast attack boat flotillas throughout the geography of the Gulf in ways that create overlapping fields of fire, covering virtually every square mile of water that a carrier strike group would need to operate in. The Gulf bases that the United States has maintained in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE represent another layer of this strategic vulnerability that rarely gets discussed openly in American media. These bases are not secret. They are enormous installations that appear on satellite imagery, that have known coordinates, and that Iranian military planners have spent decades mapping in extraordinary detail. The Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which hosts the largest American air base in the entire Middle East with thousands of personnel and hundreds of aircraft, sits a few hundred miles from Iranian territory. CENTCOM's forward headquarters operates from there. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean is farther away, but well within range of Iran's more advanced ballistic missile systems. And the naval base in Bahrain, home of the United States Fifth Fleet, sits in the Gulf itself, surrounded on three sides by water that Iran's naval forces and missile batteries can reach with ease. What military analysts have been pointing out for years, though rarely loudly enough to penetrate the mainstream public conversation, is that these bases are extraordinarily vulnerable in ways that American Cold War era military doctrine never had to seriously grapple with. During the Cold War, the threat of nuclear retaliation provided a deterrence umbrella that made conventional strikes on American bases almost unthinkable. But Iran is a non-nuclear power, at least for now, and that is a caveat that carries enormous weight. And the deterrence calculus in a conventional conflict is very different. In a conventional conflict, a nation willing to absorb punishment in return for inflicting catastrophic damage on an adversary's forward deployed assets can radically change the cost-benefit analysis that underlies American military strategy in the region. And this brings us to the deeper political and economic dimensions of what happens when something like this occurs, because the destruction of an aircraft carrier and American Gulf bases is not just a military event, it is an economic earthquake, it is a political revolution, and it is a signal flare that illuminates everything that is broken about the current global order in ways that no amount of diplomatic language can obscure. Start with the economics. The USS Abraham Lincoln alone represents an investment of billions of dollars in American taxpayer money, an investment that took years to build, that requires billions more annually to operate, and that carries with it an almost incalculable symbolic value as a representation of American military supremacy. The destruction of such a vessel doesn't just represent a financial loss, though the financial loss is staggering. It represents the public, undeniable, televised proof that American military dominance is not invincible, that the systems and strategies and doctrines that have underpinned American hegemony since the end of World War II can be defeated by a determined regional power with the right weapons and the right strategy. Markets would react to that information with the kind of violent turbulence that makes the 2008 financial crisis look like a minor correction. Oil prices would spike to levels that would devastate the American economy and the global economy simultaneously. The insurance industry would price risk in the Gulf at rates that would effectively shut down commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And without the flow of Gulf oil, the already strained and fragile architecture of the global economy faces pressures it is not remotely prepared to handle. Then there is the political dimension, which is perhaps even more profound than the economic one. The United States has built its entire post-World War II foreign policy identity around the concept of overwhelming military superiority as the guarantor of world order. This is not just strategy, it is mythology. It is the story America tells itself and the world about why the American-led international order is legitimate and permanent and beneficial. When you shatter that mythology, and the destruction of an aircraft carrier would shatter it in front of the entire watching world, you create a vacuum. And into that vacuum rush all of the competing visions of world order that have been waiting not so patiently in the wings. China, which has been methodically building its own military and economic power for 3 decades with exactly this moment in mind, would use the event to accelerate its own claims to regional hegemony in the Pacific. Russia, which has its own interests in a weakened American position, would seize the opportunity to consolidate its influence in Europe and the Middle East. And the dozens of smaller nations that have been waiting to see which way the geopolitical wind ultimately blows would begin hedging their bets more aggressively than ever before. But perhaps the most overlooked dimension of all of this is what it does to the domestic political landscape inside the United States. And this is where I think most analysts genuinely fall short, because they treat American foreign policy as if it exists in a vacuum, disconnected from the economic realities that working Americans face every single day. It does not. It never has. The cost of maintaining American military dominance in the Gulf, the carrier strike groups, the bases, the weapon systems, the personnel, the logistics, is a cost that is paid by ordinary American taxpayers, many of whom have never seen the inside of a Gulf base and have only the vaguest understanding of why their government is spending their money to project military power into a region that produces oil that is increasingly less central to American energy needs now that domestic shale production has transformed the American energy picture. The political question that gets asked in the aftermath of a catastrophe like this is simple and devastating. Was it worth it? And that question, once genuinely on the table, does not have an easy answer that any political establishment figure can give without exposing the contradictions and failures of American strategic thinking over the past several decades. Because here is the truth that gets buried under all the flag waving and all the talk of American exceptionalism and all the speeches about freedom and democracy and the rules-based international order. The United States has spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 trillion, that is trillion with a T, on military operations in the Middle East since 2001. $8 trillion. And what has that investment produced? Iraq is today more closely aligned with Iran than it is with the United States. Afghanistan fell to the Taliban within days of American withdrawal. Libya is a failed state. Syria is a humanitarian catastrophe. Yemen is experiencing what the United Nations calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And Iran, the country that American policymakers have spent decades trying to contain and isolate and pressure, has emerged from this period with more regional influence, more sophisticated military capability, and more allies than it had when this whole enterprise began. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters enormously in an analysis like this. When we talk about Iran destroying American assets, we are talking about a scenario that would have been genuinely unthinkable to most American military planners just 20 years ago, not because Iran lacked the will, but because Iran lacked the capability. The capability gap has narrowed dramatically, And that narrowing is the result of a series of strategic failures on the American side, combined with a series of strategic successes on the Iranian side that amount to one of the most significant shifts in the regional balance of power in decades. Iran's missile program, its drone program, its network of proxy forces across the region, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militia groups in Iraq and Syria, these are not accidents. They are the product of a deliberate long-term strategy by Iranian planners who understood that the path to regional power ran not through conventional military parity with the United States, which was unachievable, but through a carefully constructed web of asymmetric capabilities and regional relationships that could impose unacceptable costs on American and Israeli military operations throughout the Middle East. And here is the geopolitical reality that the mainstream American conversation almost never engages with honestly. Iran is not simply a rogue state operating in isolation. Iran is a nation of 85 million people with one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations in human history. It sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. It controls the coastline along the northern shore of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It has signed comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with both China and Russia, partnerships that give it access to sophisticated technology, diplomatic protection in international forums like the United Nations Security Council, and a degree of geopolitical insulation that makes the kind of crushing American pressure that might have worked in an earlier era far less effective in the current multipolar world. China buys Iranian oil in defiance of American sanctions. Russia shares intelligence and military doctrine. And the BRICS economic bloc, which now includes more than half the world's population and a growing share of global economic output, has been actively working to develop financial architecture that would reduce the centrality of the US dollar in international trade, which is ultimately the deepest foundation of American global power, deeper even than military capability. What this means in practical terms is that the destruction of American military assets in the Gulf does not occur in a simple bilateral conflict between the United States and Iran. It occurs in a multipolar world where American power is already being contested from multiple directions simultaneously, where American allies in Europe are increasingly uncertain about the reliability of American commitments, where American adversaries in Asia are watching every development with intense strategic interest, and where the global financial architecture that has underpinned American dominance since Bretton Woods is under more serious strain than at any point since the end of World War II. In that context, a catastrophic military setback in the Gulf is not just a military event, it is a catalyst that accelerates every other trend that is already moving in directions unfavorable to continued American hegemony. And what about the American people themselves? What about the young men and women who serve on those carriers, who staff those Gulf bases, who are the flesh and blood and bone of American military power? Because this is something that gets lost in all the strategic analysis and geopolitical abstraction. These are human beings, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, people from small towns in Ohio and Georgia and Texas who joined the military because it was the best opportunity available to them in an economy that has been systematically failing working people for decades. They are the ones who pay the ultimate price when strategic miscalculations and political failures and decades of poor decision making catch up with the nation. And they absolutely deserve a political and military leadership that is honest with them about risk, honest about strategic vulnerability, honest about what American interests in the Gulf actually are, and whether those interests are worth the price being paid. The deeper moral question that haunts all of this, and I think it is a question that Americans increasingly feel, even if they cannot always articulate it precisely, is whether the American model of projecting global military power to maintain a unipolar world order is sustainable, desirable, or even coherent in the 21st century. Because the costs of that model are not abstract. They are measured in dollars drained from schools and hospitals and infrastructure. They are measured in veterans returning home with broken bodies and broken minds. They are measured in the resentment and radicalization generated in every society that has experienced the receiving end of American military power. And they are measured in the strategic overreach that history tells us, without exception, is the beginning of the end for every empire that has attempted to maintain global dominance beyond the natural limits of its actual power and wealth. The Persian Gulf today is not just a body of water between Arabia and Iran, it is a mirror. And if Americans are willing to look honestly at what that mirror shows, the limitations of military power, the costs of strategic overreach, the consequences of foreign policies built more on ideology and corporate interest than on genuine national security calculus, then perhaps the crisis unfolding there can be the beginning of a genuinely honest national conversation about what kind of country America wants to be in the world that is coming, because that world is coming regardless. The question is only whether America enters it with eyes open or stumbles into it through the smoke and fire of a catastrophe that could have been avoided. That is the conversation we need to have, and that is what we owe each other.